Hello, everyone. Welcome to our ICON VCH Indigenous Health Round. I'm Kendall Ho. We'll be momentarily starting. And so we're just letting folks into the room. And then in about half a minute to a minute, we'll get officially started. So thank you very much for being here. Looking for this exciting round coming up. Thank you. All right, folks, we are getting our rounds underway officially. Everyone, welcome to the VCH ICON Indigenous Health Round. My name is Kendall Ho. I'm the Executive Director of ICON and really excited on behalf of the VCH Indigenous Health, together with Ministry of Health, Department of Emergency Medicine and Cultural Online Health Network, Vancouver Physician Staff Association, and First Nations Health Authority. Welcome you all to this round. Many of you may already have joined the January 26, 2023 round with our speakers, Laurie and Linda, whom I will be officially introducing. That was part one on anti-racism. Where do I start? And we were able to record it, and it's on our website. So please feel free to go check out part one. But today we go into part two. I'm so excited. I can't wait to get to the content of it. So really appreciate it. But the first thing I want to do is do a land acknowledgement. That UBC ICON is located on the land of the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I really want to welcome you here. I'm a settler myself here in Vancouver. Feel very fortunate to be doing so. I welcome you. If you would like to do acknowledgement of where you are, please feel free to use the chat and do your acknowledgement. I also like to take a special moment to remember those that are in the Turkey-Syria earthquake, all the fellow global citizens who are suffering there. And let's hope that our rescuers will try to help as many as possible. And please keep those individuals in mind. Today we're very fortunate to have again Elder Roberta. It's always such a pleasure to have Elder Roberta here with us. And so I would first like to invite Elder Roberta Price to start with a prayer. Elder Roberta is a member of the Coast Salish people. She's an elder advisor and research partner at the University of British Columbia, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome her back to give us the opening prayer before we start our presentation. Elder Roberta, thank you very much for being here.
OCM, thank you so much, Kendall. Thank you for acknowledging the unceded territories. And I start us off in a really good and respectful way, everyone. Aichka Siem Siaya, greetings and welcome, everyone. As Coast Salish matriarch and elder, I wish to give a very warm thank you to all my relatives on the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh for welcoming me to live in the unceded lands of my relatives, Musqueam, here in Richmond for 43 years now. As Coast Salish matriarch and elder, I wish to give each and every one a very warm welcome who live, work, and play, give and receive service, teach and learn on our unceded, ancestral, and occupied lands of my relatives, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh. Thank you so much, everyone, for acknowledging the lands on which you live, work, and play on in the chat. Always holding my hands up in honor and thanks to my beautiful mentor teaching elders, Elder Vince Stogan from Musqueam, Elder Bob George from Tsleil-Waututh, to always follow in their mentoring footsteps, their mentoring teachings, to always share a blessing and a prayer whenever we come together. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the teachings of our ancestors. Start us off in a good way. Aichka OCM, We give you many, many thanks, Creator, for bringing us all together here today in this wide, wide virtual circle in such a warm and respectful way. We ask, Creator, that you bless anyone who's away due to illness or other obligations. Bless the ones who may yet to join us. Help them to join safely. And we call upon you, Creator, to bring your blessings down upon our minds, our hearts, our bodies, our spirits. So when we think our thoughts, they are good, positive, and respectful. When we speak our words, they are good, positive, and respectful. We call upon you, Creator, to bless the people who prepare the food and drink. Bless the food and drink we put in to nourish our bodies on our journeys to wellness and strength. We give you kind thanks each and every day, Creator, for the special blessings of protection you bring down upon all the beautiful people who are working so very hard in so many ways, in so many places during this pandemic, for all illnesses, for the safe delivery of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and especially for the ongoing opioid crisis. Continue to bless and protect them and their families, Creator. And we kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to bring very, very special blessings of protection and healing down upon all our relatives right across Turtle Island who have reopened wounds and are grieving all over again over the ongoing daily media release. Bless and protect all our relatives in health and healing, Creator. Especially bless and protect our relatives on the North Island who have recently lost sick grandchildren. Ocean, Creator. And we kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to bring very, very special blessings of protection and healing down upon all families and people worldwide who are suffering the oppression and so bless and protect them in health and healing, Creator. And we kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to bring special blessings of protection and healing down upon Mother Earth and the wounds put upon Mother Earth, showing up in the wildfires, the extreme rain, wind, and floods, hurricanes, and earthquakes, especially affecting all the beautiful families in Turkey and Syria. Bless and protect everyone in that healing journey. And we kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to wrap each and every one of us here and all of our loved ones in your warmest blanket of protection as we all continue on this part of the journey of our lives into 2023 and beyond. Help us each to keep safe in our travels, both near and far, Creator. And we always give you many, many thanks, Creator, as we ask you to bring all of your blessings down upon all the ones that are hurting, all the ones that are grieving, all the ones that are hungry, all the ones without homes, especially, Creator, all the ones that are hurting, all the ones that are grieving. And we ask for special blessings of protection down upon all the beautiful warrior women, people of all identities that are preparing for the Women's March on Tuesday. Bless and protect all our relatives in that grieving and healing process. Haichka, Ocm. Thank you so much, everyone. Pass those sacred vows back over to you, Kendall. Ocm.
Thank you so much, Elder Roberta. You always get us started in such a peaceful spirit and thankful spirit, and thank you again for doing so for us. I really appreciate that a lot. I'd like to just let everybody know that this session is being recorded, just as we usually do. And as many of you have seen previous recordings, this idea is so that we can share the learnings and share the lessons and share the dialogues together. So I just want to let you know that this is being recorded. Today's topic, of course, is about what is an ally and who says so. And so exciting to have Laurie and Linda back. Before we go there, I'd like to just give you a bit of an overview that our speakers will be speaking for about 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll have a good half an hour to 40 minutes for exchange. During the presentations, please feel free to use the chat so that you can type in your questions, your comments, and your thoughts. And as soon as we get to the Q&A, I'll bring those questions and discussion up for conversation. I know many of you may have to leave at 1 o'clock and many of you can also stay past 1 o'clock to 1:30. So our round is going till 1:30, but do feel free if 1 o'clock, this is time that you have. I thank you very much for spending this time with us together. I'd like to also welcome now Kathy Almost to give us opening remarks on behalf of Vancouver Coastal Health, Indigenous Health. Kathy is the Director of Indigenous Cultural Safety at Vancouver Coastal Health. Kathy, so nice for you to be here. Thank you so much, and let me pass the time over to you.
Thank you, Kendall. And thank you, Elder Roberta, for just grounding us and for letting us just have those cedar boughs. That was awesome. Thank you so much. Drin Gwizi, that is good day in Gwich'in. I am Cree, Treaty 6 Cree. I am Gwich'in. I am part of the Northwest Territory Métis Association, and I'm also Scottish. Currently, I'm the Director of Indigenous Cultural Safety, as Kendall has mentioned, one of the partners of the ICON. I'm excited for Dr. Harding and Dr. Diffey to speak about allyship and understanding what that looks like. And so I just wanted to bring everybody's attention to the In Plain Sight report that was released in 2020, which made 24 recommendations and calls to action, and recommendation 11 that talks about the BC government continue its efforts to strengthen employees to speak up and to have a speak up culture throughout the entire healthcare system, and to help us to move forward with this important work as we listen and learn today. So thanks so much, Kendall, and I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thank you very much, Kathy. I also would, it's a pleasure to have Dr. Dawn Wilson also giving us some opening remarks. Dr. Wilson is the Regional Medical Director of Vancouver Coastal Health, Indigenous Health, and wonderful to have you here with us, Dr. Wilson. Let me pass the time over to you.
I was about to say good morning to everybody, but it's actually now good afternoon to everybody. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome everybody to this ICON Zoom meeting. As always, it's a tremendous pleasure for me to hear the words and prayers of Elder Dr. Roberta Price with her PhDs and honorary titles. I never like to let that pass. She deserves that recognition. And it's so good to see you, Elder Roberta. It's nice to meet the rest of you that I've had a chance to interact with in the pre-meeting. I myself am a member of the Heiltsuk Nation. On the map, my territory is centralized in Bella Bella. So that's where I was born and raised on the reserve. I left at the age of 14 to go to high school and then university, initially in the territory of the Coast Salish peoples down in Victoria. I've been an obstetrician gynecologist in general practice for the last 16 and a half years now. I'm currently doing a locum in the beautiful unceded territories of the in the town of Squamish at the moment. So I'm actually on call. It's very fortunate that I did not have to be in the hospital at the moment. I beg your forgiveness if I suddenly disappear, because it means I'm being called away, but there's nothing going on labor and delivery at the moment. I really like the title and the purpose of today's meeting. What is an ally and what does it mean? The fact that every one of you showed up to this meeting today, those of you that have shown up, shows that you are in the process of building allyship. It's a tremendous multifaceted work that all of us are called to do. We all can be allies to others who need our allyship. It's a process of sharing our privilege, of sharing our capacities, of sharing our knowledge. It's a great deal of hard work that goes into allyship, and you're all engaging in that today as we participate in this meeting. So my pleasure to be involved. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'll turn it back to Kendall.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. And now I'd like to also introduce Sherry Barr, in fact, an old friend of ours and been working with you, Sherry, for so many years as special advisor to the BC Ministry of Health Primary Care Branch, and also involved in many years as Patients as Partners, has been tremendously advising us and guiding us in ICON. Sherry, let me pass it over to you for your comments.
Thanks, Kendall. Thanks for the opportunity to provide the today's session on what is an ally and who says so. I think this is going to be a very important topic, and I'm looking forward to it as well. And also a big thank you to Elder Roberta. I'm so appreciative of getting my head in the right space and feeling prepared to learn today. I'm Sherry Barr. I'm a senior provincial primary healthcare advisor and work on patients as partners in the primary care division in the Ministry of Health. I would like to acknowledge and offer respect to the Lekwungen people on whose traditional territory I'm on today, and to the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And also acknowledge the Métis chartered community in this area. I'm a settler in this area, third generation, mostly Eastern European, bit of Asian, North African, and Jewish mixed in as well. What I work on in the Ministry of Health is patients as partners, and we believe that we can make the health system better when patients and their families, healthcare providers, and community partners work together. Our patientsaspartners.ca website has a calendar that describes free educational events such as ICON's event today, multicultural chronic disease management events, and many others that can benefit your patients and their families. So I invite you to take a look. These sessions are all free to the participants. Patients as Partners has collaborated with and funded ICON for over 10 years now, with Dr. Kendall Ho as the executive director, and they have been doing an exemplary job. So thank you so much for all your work. Bringing people together for discussions and moving forward with many issues of the day. However, as we saw from the In Plain Sight report, there's still a lot more that we can do to eliminate racism in healthcare and achieve reconciliation. Part one of our presentation was discussing personal reflection, and today's presentation is going to be focused on action. So I am quite excited to learn more and take another step on my journey. And thank you to all the organizers and presenters. I appreciate your time. I look forward to learning more from your experiences so that we can all build personal and professional confidence and competence in addressing systemic racism. Thank you.
Wonderful.
And over to you, Kendall.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I am so excited now to invite our speakers, Dr. Laurie Harding and Dr. Linda Diffey, to speak on the subject of allyship. Move us into action, as Sherry said. Just to introduce, Dr. Laurie Harding is an author and adjunct professor at UVic with extensive experience in facilitation education in the Indigenous cultural safety and Indigenous anti-racism in the context of health and child welfare. She's co-author with Dr. Barry Lavallee in White Benevolence, White Benevolence, Racism and Colonial Violence in the Helping Profession. And Dr. Linda Diffey is a member of the Pipikikis Cree Nation in the Treaty 4 region, an Indigenous scholar in community health sciences, and Oknomiswin Indigenous Institute of Health and Healing. She co-led the development and implementation of the Indigenous Health curriculum in undergraduate medical education at the Max Rady College of Medicine and served as a co-editor of the National Undergraduate Medicine Curricular Framework for Indigenous Health. Laurie and Linda, welcome. We look forward to your teaching and your sharing with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think, Laurie, I think I'll go first, and then I'll throw it over to you. That's okay. Yes, thank you for the wonderful introductions, and thank you in particular to our elder, Roberta, for the, once again, just a really great way to start us off in a good way. As Kendall mentioned, I'm a member of Pegasus Cree Nation. I'm Plains Cree from Treaty 4, but I live and work in Treaty 1 territory, which is the land of the Anishinaabe, Oji-Cree, Cree, Dene, and Lakota people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. My work is very much centered on anti-racism and teaching Indigenous health within medicine and medical education. And that was the focus of my dissertation, which I recently completed just in the fall. And my work has really taken a focus on faculty development and helping and supporting my colleagues who are Indigenous and non-Indigenous on taking this path to disrupt systemic racism within medical and health education. I'll talk a bit more about how that led to me developing the BRAID network in a few slides, but I'll just bookmark that for now. And I believe we're going to be sharing a list of resources and a link to my thesis if you're interested. I explored the experiences of medical school educators who were applying an anti-racist, anti-colonial lens in their teaching at our medical school. Allyship is something that is deeply meaningful for me in my work. I don't feel like I could do this work if I wasn't supported by wonderful allies, such as Laurie Harding. Laurie, I don't know what I'd do without you. And with that, I'll kick it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Linda. And yeah, I get emotional doing these talks and thinking about the relationships along the way, and who's got me to stand up and speak up and be where I am today. And I'll start by recognizing that I'm a white settler with Scottish and English ancestry, and I occupy Cowichan territory, colonially known as Shawnigan Lake. And I'll talk more about when we do a piece on land and territorial acknowledgement a little bit further on, and what I've come to know even this week more and more about who I am and who I am in relationship with Indigenous people living on Indigenous land. And so grateful for the relationships, for Linda's invitation to come and work with her at the BRAID program. Building relationships and anti-Indigenous racism development was, I didn't even let her finish the invite. I think, yeah, I want to do that. So I'm really happy to support that work. And also always acknowledging Dr. Barry Lavallee. He was the content specialist in my doctoral research on Indigenous specific anti-racism. And that thesis is also a link on there. So you have both of you have the long story. We only have a little bit of time today, but we got a lot of resources, and I'm happy to connect with people afterwards and ongoing. And always like to remember to acknowledge and Elder Roberta Price. I build anxiety getting up to these presentations. I try to just have half a caffeine so that I can not go over the top with the anxiousness and excitement and engagement in this topic, because it is so vital. This is health systems right now there's a fire going off right now with normalized stereotypes, the conditions of fast-paced, underfunded systems being underfunded, and having to have those responses really quick. And our amygdala activates first before our frontal cortex. So I thought of these, that compiling with the opioid crisis, with COVID, and now with staff shortages, really thinking about all of the people that are here today and the conditions that you're working with, and recognizing that that doesn't mean, some people have said, well, it means we don't have time to do cultural competency or cultural safety. It means we must do more because the conditions are ripe for activation of bias and racism. So like to think of that at the front. And Elder Roberta, hey, you help me to breathe better when I'm anxious thinking about the depth of these topics, and so appreciative, Kendall, to have your staff here to support us in the process. So we've got a few slides to work through, and we'll just keep on trucking on with the material. So that next slide is just the image of that. That other one was just the poster picture we created for the braid session. So this next one is around an outline that we have for all of the sessions that we do, to remember that we are always considering who we are in relationship with Indigenous peoples. When we're looking at Indigenous specific racism, it's a relational work. And as Linda said, we can't do this alone, and allyship is all about creating allied partnerships, collaborations. And even when we think of partnerships, I watch myself, because I know my colonial mind will start to think of partnerships as equal partnerships. And when we're looking at unparalleled inequities, Indigenous people's sovereign rights come to mind first. And that what that means is that if our allied relationship breaks down, who is harmed more within these around relationships, around stakeholder identity and outcomes, and chose that image there of the person with the magnifying glass. So we're looking deeply at these topics, but also holding a mirror up to who we are, because we have to know who we are to know how we impact other peoples that we're working with. And another point we like to bring up always in these workshops is to look closely at terminology and to consider clarity around, if we know what we mean. Even a definition of a term is not enough. We want to know how it manifests, what it means in outcomes, and how to dismantle the topic of Indigenous specific racism, not just knowing what it is, but what we need to do with it. So for this talk today, we wanted to look at allyship, solidarity, co-conspirator. We're going to get into some of those definitions in some depth. Also performativity and white savourism, which were newer to me, and I'll give some examples in my own experience of learning and developing, and also getting into how we can create communities. And there are privileges and power that have to be recognized in these relationships. And Len Pierre's has a Len Pierre Consulting. If you take note, that's in the list. He has a link now. He's Katzie First Nation, brilliant speaker, and his discussion recently did an hour-long free webinar on territorial acknowledgements, and I learned a lot more again there. So lots of learning around those pieces. And then we'll just hop back over to the next one, is about back to the land, whose land we are on. So in the chat, people have noted where they are located. And in the context of allyship, we're always thinking about the occupation of Indigenous land and acknowledging those complexities and those very different realities, and how non-Indigenous peoples have arrived to these lands and continue to arrive on Indigenous lands. So in naming Indigenous peoples and race identifiers we use in relationship to white peoples, there are identifiers such as Black. You will have heard of BIPOC, people of color, or racialized people who all will face racism in the systems, and want to acknowledge that those identifiers are not perfect. They're changing. We're developing understanding and recognition about what's more respectful, and also, of course, wanting to identify people with their own identifiers, as they like to be called. So in naming them, we think about white European people like me. We've been coming to occupy these lands to get ahead for a very long time. And personally for myself, my paternal side in England, we took advantage of Songhees lands, also known as in 1913, and my father had a home on the parking lot of the Uptown Mall. That's where that mall is now. So when I drive by there, I think about what that land would have looked like, the forests and the trees. When he was born in 1922 in Victoria, but my grandparents came from England, and that's where they lived. And my grandfather was a orderly at the Royal Jubilee Hospital. So I wonder about the treatment of Indigenous people in that hospital then, because I know that racism is occurring there now. So making those links to myself. So wherever I've been, wherever I've lived in what's called Canada now, thinking about that contrast. And on my maternal side, my mother was born in Scotland in 1923 and came in 1927 at 4 years old, and got off the train coming across Canada. They were headed for Victoria, but the land prospectors had posters of free land in Fraser Lake and Fort Fraser at that time. And so, of course, I know my grandmother, they got off that train and they made arrangements to take advantage of some preempted land from the Natalie-Witten people. So I've been back to go and walk on that land and see this huge tracts of land. And those maps are available. And I invite you to Google preemption. And that's the legal process of land theft for Indigenous peoples. And it was so stunning to me that I had never heard of that. I was never taught that in school, and how important it is into understanding why and how I could live here on unceded ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples wherever I live across Canada. So really important history pieces that are not fully taught. And then the painful truth is that all non-Indigenous people will benefit from that theft, regardless of how, when our ancestors got here. And I just want to recognize and acknowledge the refugee status of people still coming here under incredible duress, fleeing war-torn countries to get ahead, and acknowledging that those differences they're different from mine and from other people who look like me coming here. And then also remembering that the land where we are today and our benefits and our access to health systems comes at the cost to Indigenous peoples. So I remember being taught about Indigenous history, and then now remembering to always tie myself to that's not just Indigenous history, it's history of settlers coming to Indigenous land. So it's a relational history, and it's shared history, and those realities are part of the foundation for learning about allyship, who we are in relationship. So we had a question that we would invite you to write down in your journals. So as part of the learning is for white settlers like me, if it's possible, it's important to track our relationships with Indigenous peoples on the land, including whose land and when our family first occupied and benefited from colonization. So do your own personal history connection to Indigenous land. So I think of myself, I was born in Cold Lake, Alberta on the Air Force base. My father was in the Air Force. So that was Dene Cold Lake territory. So thinking about why I lived there and I didn't see or know or meet any Indigenous children, and where they were taken to school. So everywhere I've lived, there's a history for myself, people who look like me, and for Indigenous people. So that's a good way to work to embody allyship. And the next slide is about, we're getting into this topic now, and we want to acknowledge and respect emotions. This is a difficult history, so naturally, and if connecting to our humanity raises emotion. So want to make sure to respect that can be a part of the process of the learning, and that discussing racism can be potentially triggering, especially for Indigenous and people of color who experience racism on a daily basis. And while I remember that while this reality of racism in any service is disturbing, it must be recognized to be addressed. We have to name it, to do something about it. And discussions about race and racism can be discomforting for white folks like me. And I encourage you to lean into those emotions and identify those as indicators of compassion and a gateway to learning. So anti-racism knowledge, self-awareness, and intervention skills are now recognized as imperative and part of our the necessity of providing safer services. So we have on our list of resources some support numbers. There's KUAS First Nations and Aboriginal Crisis Line available, Métis Crisis Line, and a few other links and numbers for services. And also just to remember that we're here to connect if you want to speak to us after. And there are some other supports through VCH as well, and supports specifically for physicians. The next slide, we're going to pop it over to look at this quote around this topic, and again, thanking Elder Roberta Price for helping us to stay present and keep grounded while we're learning to get comfortable with discomfort and getting into the necessity of looking at and talking racism, anti-racism, and all the manifestations throughout health systems. So this quote is by Daryl Wing Su, and he's got a couple of books on racism, and microaggressions are his specialty and topic, and really explaining that. And I remember the first time I heard the term microaggressions, I thought, man, there's nothing micro about, there's nothing small as in micro, but understanding that micro means close. So it's the closeness of the harm to Indigenous and BIPOC folks who are targeted and face this racism, that it's embodied and affecting health and wellness and access to life expectancy. Every marker in health is a contrast from my population representation in health inequities. So in this discussion and looking at getting comfortable, I looked at another academic, Dr. Angie Beeman, and she explained that there's nothing wrong with recognizing that privilege and racism exist. We can't get to solutions by denying the problem. And she says we should also question why we focus so much on the comfort level of white people rather than the blocked opportunities, threats, and loss of life for Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx. Gender neutral, that's the identifier there, for community that those communities face, and how we can effectively change those conditions. She says, certainly many Black and Brown people may feel disrespected at the inordinate, yet the predictable focus is on how to make white people more comfortable as institutions and organizations awkwardly lean into these conversations about race and racism, spurred by the summer of 2020 racial reckoning. So she goes on to say, avoiding white privilege is a horrible anti-racism strategy, and here's why. And she references Dr. Brownlee, Dana Brownlee. I recommend following her on Twitter at Dana Brownlee. She says, when the focus is on making white people more comfortable, racial inequity is bound to be maintained. She says, if we want to challenge racism and the other forms of discuss it openly and honestly, and this may turn some people away, but it may also bring more people to the table who are tired of being silenced or overly cautious about issues that affect their everyday lives and survival. And Beeman says, white privilege exists, and we cannot create change by pretending it does not exist to spare the feelings of those who benefit from it. So I think about the choreography our minds do in trying to get around some of these discussions, and really naming those pieces really clearly, and getting to that place where we can have a speak up and really speak in culture, where we pull each other into these dialogues and these discussions. And she says, arguably, the mere idea of performing linguistic gymnastics in order to avoid the term white privilege, that many would argue is a simple historical fact, is somewhat insulting and disrespectful to Brown and Black communities. So some of this may sound a little tough. I admit it creates anxiety, but I know for me, we can earn a seat at the table to discuss race and racism when we know what it is we're talking about, and when we can actually speak from a place of recognition. We will never understand. Settlers like me will never understand what that meaning is, because we'll never live that experience, but we can certainly learn more and collaborate and ally with Indigenous people and brown and Black people to do the work. So we're going to go deeper into allyship and self-awareness. And again, I note that I am a constant learner too, and always playing catch up. And this will not be news to racialized and Indigenous participants. So we'll just go on to the next slide around. Linda's going to talk about the terms for this kind of engagement.
Yeah, and I really, when I think of what we're doing here with this is actually part of a workshop series that we've been developing for the BRAID Network, which is a project that I'm leading here at the University of Manitoba in our Faculty of Health Sciences, and it really grew out of what I recognized was a need to build more allies and accomplices within the faculty. A couple of years ago, when I was thinking about this project, I really had a lot of white settler colleagues who were aware of the work that I was doing in medicine around anti-racism and challenging colonial systems, and were very interested in taking that up in their own classrooms and in their departments, but really didn't know where to start. And I felt that, I could contribute, and support their journeys by building a network where we could learn together and to really work on redefining how we work together as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in health education. So BRAID has grown into a really exciting project that Laurie's been very involved in. She is our lead facilitator in our workshop series, which we have every 6 weeks. This workshop is an abbreviated version of one of the workshops that we held. We also have a reading circle that we alternate with every 6 weeks, and we have a number of other resources that you'll be able to access through the links that are going to be shared with you. And I'm going to just spend just a short amount of time, because we covered this in the last session as well. For all of our BRAID activities, we like to share these terms of engagement, and just to really, always put front and center, like position ourselves in doing this work as we're undergoing this learning, think about our identity and who we are, when we come to this work of Indigenous anti-racism, and always going in with this idea that we need to unlearn and deconstruct what society, Canadian society, has really, marinated us in, really. And so it's always this unlearning and relearning process. That we have to be very vigilant about assessing the impact of our lack of knowledge that has on others, and to know that there's a certain vulnerability, and for some people experience this as shame when going through this process, but it's important to push through that and to not get stuck at that stage. As Laurie mentioned, discomfort also part of this process, and most importantly, taking responsibility, which means action, which is what we're focusing on today. And we'll go to the next slide. And so just briefly, the objectives for today, we're going to talk about the difference between being an ally and being a white savior, apply this knowledge in doing ongoing self-reflective work, because this work is built around self-reflection and self-learning, and question new ideals, concepts, models in order to understand and apply them in a safer manner. And we're going to examine some of the impacts of Indigenous specific stereotypes on our racial identity. And go to the next slide, please. And this is, we don't have time. If we were doing this as our normal, 2-hour workshop, we'd build in a bit more interactive parts to it, but we did want to not remove those activities, because we feel that those are important in undertaking this work. So you're going to have this as part of the resource list, so that you can take the time that you need to do these activities. And this activity is what we call, do I know what I think? What do I know, and how did I learn about Indigenous peoples and the colonization of the lands where I now live? So Laurie's been sharing a bit about that and how she came to learn about that. And it's interesting for me as an Indigenous person to think about this from a slightly different perspective. And I think about the contrast between, what I learned in my K-12 education in the 70s and early 80s, and the complete, almost complete erasure of Indigenous histories in that process, and how I really, had to learn about that myself with great effort. And also, even you would think, growing up within a First Nations family, you know, a lot of the pain and suffering that generations of my family experienced. 3 generations before me survived residential school, but it was such a traumatic experience that my mother and my aunts and uncles and grandparents, they didn't talk about it. So I didn't even really understand until I was a lot older and started to explore it myself, what this really meant for me in the context of Canada, but also in a very personal way. So, to me, it's very, I still find it, something I reflect on a lot, about how much we don't learn about this. Things are starting to change. I see the younger generations getting more formal education about that, and that's great. But a lot of us are still having to really face those realities as adults and within our professions. And I think with that, I'll shoot it over to you, Laurie, because I know you had some reflections on this slide as well.
Yeah, that's okay. I was thinking we're kind of, yeah, this piece around the education of what we were given. Holy man, I remember the shock. It was a visceral shock feeling when I watched a video when I was 35 in BA in Child and Youth Care about residential schools. Like the big old monitors trundled out to the classroom and they flicked the light on and came on in more ways than one. It was like, wow, was I ever lied to? Nobody told me about that. Or it was mentioned in a way that it was tucked in little ways, so it didn't register with me as something that was connected to me as a white settler growing up and living on these territories, and why I didn't see Indigenous children living that I should have been playing with. We were a very small town. We're at 4 crossroads, and the white settler village ended and the reserve was next across the road. And there were children in those houses, but I never saw them. They went off to school, the Catholic school up on the hill. And I didn't understand why we were not playing together, just the way it was. So what did I think about Indigenous people? I'd never unpacked that. So I'm still and will always be digging into what that is, and how the colonial project of creating Canada was intent on keeping us separate and growing up in these separate places. But when you talk about that education, so even if the kids are learning now, we're learning at all these different places, white supremacy is like a car wash. When you walk out the door, how do you stick it on? How do you keep it on your body and in your mind and in your conscious thought around your practical skill set? So the car wash of white supremacy, and the book White Supremacy and Me was really great. Lala Said's book that we just did a debrief on that yesterday. So really great book on that. So do I know what I think? I sure didn't until I started thinking about what I think. And Barry Lavallee talks about the conscientization of thinking about our racist indoctrination. So we'll go on more. Next slide. There's so much there. This quote, I'll just say this, this indicates the depth of racism on what we now call Canada, and why allyship with Indigenous people is necessary. And that Samara Tabani's book, Exalted Subjects, is on the list, I believe, in the link, but that's out of that book. Oh yeah, it's on my slide. Yeah, Exalted Subjects, Studies in the Making of Race and a Nation in Canada. So that's a big history lesson if you're curious to learn more about how you became Canadian. The next slide is
I'm just popping the link in the chat for everybody.
Great. Thanks, Linda. And then the next one's where we do the Mentimeter and ask everybody what they think an ally is. So we'll do a round of definitions, and you'll be able to enter into the Mentimeter. feel free to enter a few definitions, and we'll see what everybody comes up with. So we'll do that for a few minutes, and we'll get into the responses a little bit later on, and do some definitions and break down the definitions and terminologies. So.
Yes, I think I've got it set so that you can put in up to 3 responses or words that you think of when you think of the word ally. And it should
Does that
be on
seem
the
to be
screen.
working okay?
Is it coming up?
I don't see it, but oh, I see something there.
Up there, it looks like it's starting. Oh, the Menti code. The Menti code, I will put that in the chat. It should be, oh, it didn't show up on the, apologies. I will copy the code.
Just while we're doing that, I see MM Saunders noting about the Indian Hospital in Nanaimo. I grew up in Nanaimo. My kids were born in Nanaimo, in the Nanaimo Hospital. And my dad was on that when we were 2 years old. When I was 2 years old, we lived on the grounds that were adjacent to the Indian Hospital. Never knew anything about that. So there's some stunning erasure that and the depth of not knowing is really hard to consider when you think about what that did and what that allowed for people who are in those hospitals to be. We know that there was experimentation going on there, lots of harm. Okay, I see. Oh, some people are putting them into the chat too. That's great. Advocate and learner. Active participant, yeah. I think those terms really speak to action.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, being of service. So we'll get into that too, like not driving the bus, but co-piloting or even standing behind when, depending on what's needed. Shoulder to shoulder. Thanks, Kendall. Yeah, lots of questions come up when you start to look deeply. Thanks, Anne, noting about Campbell Hospital. When we start to think really critically, it becomes allyship and Indigenous anti-racism development becomes a part of your lens and the way you view your work, your education services, and what's going on in health and equities. Humility, open-minded learning. Yeah, we'll compile all those and give them back to you for your definition. Do you think just in the
it looks like the word cloud's working now. There it is.
Wow. I'm thinking so we need to print that and keep that in the in the slide deck. That's a thing of beauty.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Isn't that fantastic? It's the contrast to the wordle I created for the stereotype harm. That's the medicine or the yeah. Nicely done. That looks great. Should we go on to the next slide?
Yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. And we can share. We'll do a screenshot of this after, and we can share it in the notes as well.
Great. All right. Thank you. That is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can go back to the deck. Yeah, here's a definition.
There we go. Yeah, yeah. So so you've probably hit on with that in the word cloud and in the responses you gave in the chat, many of the concepts that are in this allyship definition. That's from the Anti-Oppression Network, which is a wonderful resource. I tend to go to their website quite a bit when I'm talking about this topic and use a lot of their resources. So as we've mentioned, it's action oriented, it's consistent, and it's an arduous practice. And like I said before, it's about unlearning and re-educating ourselves, and recognizing our positions of privilege and power, and how can we use those to operate in solidarity with a group whose equity has been denied. And so allyship, it's important to note, is not an identity. It's not something that we define for ourselves. It's really, if you think of it as more of a process and really relational. And so that relationship with the group that you're working with is so critical in terms of relational accountability and basically staying on the right path, and doing the work in a good way. The work of allyship is something that we, much like cultural safety, which is defined by the person receiving service and deeming whether cultural safety, whether an interaction is culturally safe. It's the group that you're working with that defines whether you are an ally or not. These are really kind of core concepts of allyship. We'll go to the next slide, please. And so what does it require to engage in this active allyship? Well, it's, as we've been, the recurrent theme is self-reflection, reflecting and acknowledging our power and privilege. And also, being in that position to always remember to listen more, speak less, to not center ourselves, and to really, just really listen. And communicate and taking direction from the group that we are working with. When sometimes in engaging in allyship, there's many opportunities to intervene, certainly to interrupt. Racism would be one example. And these are times when it's like, being invited by a group to engage in this, just like I invite Laurie all the time to come and join me in anti-racism work and teaching. It's about, getting that permission from the group that you're working with. Constantly, it's a lifelong journey, educating ourselves, being open to receiving feedback and criticism about how we're engaging in allyship. And like Laurie had gone over, embracing and respecting the emotions that come with this, but not taking those emotions to center ourselves and take attention away from the work that we're engaged in. And we'll go to the next slide. And there's also, along with responsibilities, there's professional roles that we have that are related to challenging oppression in power structures. So it's showing up and using our power and privilege in those settings to serve as an advocate, and to turn the spotlight away from us if we are in the position of holding power and privilege, and elevating the voices that are being silenced and ignored. There's also, in our professional roles, always opportunities to engage with others, and to, again, it's another way of centering voices that tend not to be heard, and to really work together with them. And when we're in the position of working as an ally, always reminding ourselves that our needs are secondary. And that, we aren't doing this for recognition. We're doing this because it's the right thing to do, and that we have a position that allows us to engage in this work and to be effective in interrupting oppression. And we'll just go to the next slide. I think that's back to you, Laurie.
Okay. Yeah, so this one talks about, these are the exits and off ramps you may be familiar with. I know I've heard of these before. Does anyone else recognize these thoughts? Feel free to put a yes in the chat. We can do a frequency on that. So I'm pretty sure I've had most of these thoughts at one time and can now recognize them as tied to emotions and socially sanctioned stereotypical beliefs about the other, or anyone who's seen to be not white. So when we know these stereotypes, then we can stop them and hold them before they influence our actions and our relationships. So the exits can also be called moves to innocence, and to get away from painful truths and responsibilities. So you've possibly heard about the seminal work by Tuck and Yang, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, and their 2012 paper is in some of the resources, and it's in decolonization, indigeneity, education, and society. So they said that was a provocative point at that time, that these were moves to innocence, and actually I can feel that that's what it has been for me too. When we talk about not doing things for recognition, this challenge with that is that white identity development in that process of developing critical race theory understanding and about whiteness, one of the stages is about recognizing or possibly being overwhelmed by the immensity of the issue, and then scrambling. You have this cognitive dissonance. How do I manage that? And that taking these exits and off ramps can be a part of that development. So hanging in there and getting on to the next slide also gets into some of the other barriers. And these are conditions that I can reflect on and recall myself. Fear of offending. Anybody else recognize some of those? And you probably can name some of these yourself. So additional characteristics within the medical field are the urgency requirement for answers, when we really need to sit with and think and feel some of these emotions, because if we're trying to constantly push them down, we're never going to get to the place where we actually bring them out, process them, understand what they are, how they are impacting our relationships. I remember sitting in a boardroom being the only white woman and being completely existentially challenged in cultural ways, is what we would say now, to look at that and understanding that just sitting there and being there in that space was about thinking about the contrast for an Indigenous person at the boardroom table and what that might feel like. Where are you silenced? Are you heard? So. And then when the other person, like thinking about myself, am I feeling defensive when someone's idea is promoted above mine? So all of those relational pieces come up as barriers in allyship. And one of the resources on your list is White Supremacy Culture Characteristics by Tema Okun. She really breaks it down really well, some of these the fear of offending and how it manifests in practice, and then also counters what to do about that. So highly recommend that resource. And the next one is about white savior complex. And so this is something that people may not have heard this term, but this is building your literacy, is looking at what white savior complex is, attempting to save people of color. And this is completely connected to health. We think about nurses and social workers. I'm a social worker by background. So the socialization to save, to help, rather than to collaborate and to work together as a complementary place where we can use our white power and privilege to push inequities onto the table and into action. White saviorism it's a form of false generosity, and it maintains and embodies white supremacy and frames the white outsider as the savior and hero. And the people of color are seen as too oppressed or too downtrodden or too powerless to help themselves. So that may be really hard to consider and to hear. And we recommend having a look at, there's a link in there about the Solidarity Initiative, about white saviorism within education. And also there's a big piece on that in the White Benevolence book. There's several chapters in there around white savior complex and what that does and how it shows up in the work. And the next one, I'm zooming through because I'm really thinking about the time here, and I wanted to get to these. So white performativity is something that people may not have heard of. I hadn't heard of it until like maybe 3 years ago, new in my work. And working at UVic, and one of the profs there sent me an email and said, you know, Laurie, your email is freaking a white performativity. And I had this heart-stopping panic. What have I done? Oh, I'm a bad person. So recognizing now that she was giving me a gift of helping me to go and look at the language that I was using, and that I was speaking over her and planning for her. And she was completely capable of doing this, but I thought I was helpful. So performativity is something to watch out for. And you know, I thank Dr. Sarah Wright Cardinal at UVic for teaching me and calling me in with that example. When we think about performative allyship, we want to think about what are the signs and why leaders get exposed. And you have a link there for Carmen Morris's work in 2020. And she says that far from being supportive of an anti-racist agenda, performative allyship has a disturbing influence which stifles progress and has a detrimental effect of suppressing attempts to foster genuine inclusivity in workplace environments. So performative allyship has the power to completely derail work and racial equality. So when it's enacted in organizations, employees of different backgrounds stand little chance of ever breaking through systemic barriers that have been designed by those in power. So there's lots more in that resource to finish off that topic, but I encourage you to have a look at that. And the next slide is another one that people we get to is like, okay, wow, this is so overwhelming. I'm afraid to speak because I might say the wrong thing, but I know I need to show up. And being groomed to believe as individuals that we are the knowers, because you think about the racial ratio of teachers, doctors, the people in places of power are white. And for me, I didn't consider who I was automatically tracking to listen to as credible and as people to listen to and learn. And then when you think about listening and learning in race and racism, not so much. We really need to, I know I needed to learn deeply from Indigenous peoples and Indigenous leaders that have been doing this work for generations and holding all the weight of the work. So recognizing that that overwhelming feeling, and some people can feel personally slighted or attacked if they are called in, and realizing that people often, we know that people have good intentions. If you're working in healthcare, you have good intentions to help people. That's why you're here. So we can have good intentions and care deeply and still ask what we can do when my people are the problem. So it's a reasonable question to think about. How have I managed to not know all of this time? People maybe have worked. I met a teacher who had worked for 30 years and had never heard of residential school. Like, how is it that people can work so long in an institution that has caused such great harm and not manage to not know about, say Indian hospitals if you work in healthcare? So the answer about not knowing will be different for white and racialized participants. And the link to white fragility is in that book, and that Robin DiAngelo speaks to the luxury of not knowing and not having to learn about race and racism being about power and privilege. And I recall being stunned when I first truths about settler colonialism and hearing about legislated and systemically reinforced racism. So even though this reality has surrounded me for my entire life, I felt like a deer in the headlights when I first started learning about this, and anxiously go to Indigenous people for answers who don't need to have my unlearning carry the weight of that and to be carrying that weight. So thinking about our learning and the need for us to do our own work is a part of that, what we have to do or what we can do. I'll just pass it back to Linda around the next slide around allyship and accomplice and co-conspirator.
Thanks, Laurie. Yeah, and I don't think you can have a discussion about this topic without addressing the ever evolving terminology that surrounds it. And we'll share with you in the notes an article from Dr. Tiffany Jana from a couple of years ago, where she really goes into, I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong pronouns, where they go into the difference between these terms and how allyship isn't enough when the world is on fire. That's part of the title. And it's raises some very interesting points about allyship, and that you can claim to be an ally while doing very little that actually in the action department. So in terms of being an ally, you could be doing reading, learning, watching, privately discussing issues, and kind of taking those first steps, but never really advancing to the next step of disrupting, really. And so just to read a quote from this article, Dr. Jana said, "In today's world, an ally is mostly someone who believes in the equal rights of all people or a specific group of people. An ally is someone who supports equal justice in theory, often with thoughts and prayers, and sometimes with words in small group settings. I believe that contemporary allyship remains entirely too personal and self-centered." So really that's, kind of the when it goes astray, when we start centering ourselves too much in the process, and not moving outward to actually affect change in systems. So some people have found allyship as a term, as a concept, being inadequate, and have moved towards terms like accomplice and co-conspirator. One note, and this I can relate to this thought because it was one that I held for a while. I didn't like the negative connotations that were associated with accomplice or co-conspirator. Sounded like something associated with criminal acts. But a way that we can reframe our thinking about these terms is to think about being an accomplice or a co-conspirator as being in an alliance against the state that's to reinforce colonialism and systems of oppression. And so that kind of flips the script around. And to me, making that mental shift really helped me to embrace these terms. And we'll go to the next slide. And so to think about, well, what's the difference? If we think of allyship as being part of a continuum, and this is the foundational thinking and learning stage, and really just kind of those very first steps, and that accomplice is more of a reactive response, and taking what you've learned and making some changes to disrupt and interrogate systems of oppression that we see, and and then if we go to the next stage of being a co-conspirator, we can see that as perhaps being the more proactive phase, where we're really working alongside the communities that we support. We're seeking to redefine and forge meaningful relationships between ourselves and the community that they support. And this is the ultimate kind of goal. So moving from that allyship through accomplice to actually becoming a co-conspirator is a way to see ourselves, and then we're really putting ourselves out there, really putting ourselves out on the line, and binding our actions to the priorities of the group that we're working with. And we'll just take a look at the next slide, which is I'm a very visual person, so I really love this visual, and so I love Venn diagrams too, to really kind of see how where these parts overlap, or where we can see things like that white performativity that Laurie was talking about, or where we're not actually taking direct action. So really like having to do a lot of self-reflection in this work to make sure that we're not sliding off and going on those exit ramps of veering into being a white savior, just being more performative about things. So just a way of taking those same concepts and visualizing them. And we'll just go to the next slide. And again, this is going to be on the notes sheet that you'll get after this. And it's really a chance for you to think about when you're taking on this work or thinking about taking on this work, and what helps you move forward and to put yourself more on the line, and what prevents you from doing that. And, you know, when I think of this for myself, I think of, you know, how working in relationship with my non-Indigenous colleagues is something that really fuels me to go through this work, which can be very taxing. You know, I'm often pushing back on systems of anti-Indigenous racism within healthcare and health education systems, and having allies or having co-conspirators rather is something that really helps me to continue in the work. And what stops me is, you know, probably just the overwhelming, when I stop and think about the overwhelming nature of how much energy it takes to change systems. And if I get bogged down in that, I don't think I could move at all. And so I really try to stay focused on those relationships, on you know, that taking action and doing the work. As a way to move past that and to not get stuck and bogged down in the enormity of the task. I always tell people that, you know, really how I keep going is that I just look at my small little corner of the world and what can I do today to make a change in it. And so whether it's participating in and you know, being a co-presenter in an event like this, or, you know, working with students, I just always try to think of like something I can do to just, you know, take it on in small bites. So Laurie, I don't know if you want to segue into, you know, do a bit of a reflection before we talk about why allies are needed.
Yeah, no, let's just hop right over to that. And I think people are reflecting on that and why this work is important. And the hierarchy of white supremacy is the root for the formation of this country, and the control of Indigenous people is rooted in the ideology that Indigenous peoples were savages and less than human. That's a quote from Sartre in 1963. So it's not a new idea. So one look, you know, at the roots of Canada, you know, we can see where these beliefs about Indigenous peoples and the treatment, the blatant capacity to treat people with less, to discriminate and treat with less services has been a part of Canada there. And that's slide 24. And then if we can hop, skip and jump.
Laurie, sorry, just a quick point about the fact that we're about 13 minutes away from the end. Just to let you know. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So I was thinking we could hop to the number 28, and these ones you'll have access to these ones. They're all really just summary points, but the what can I do one is probably one of the most important ones here, and practically applying this is really this piece that you've heard us speak to quite in depth here, is about learning more about our identity and how this intersects with power and privilege. So whether you're Indigenous or a BIPOC person or a white settler, we all have different relationships with power and privilege on this land. And also to learn more about Indigenous specific racism, why it's unique in source, intent, and impact. And as you know, the ratios are pretty horrific. So the piece around collaborating with colleagues to learn how to identify and interrupt stereotypes. So creating, one of the things we're looking at, Braid, is creating communities of practice and creating communities of anti-racist practice. So this is work that people, I know for myself, I'm lucky enough to have colleagues. It's not luck, it's, you know, I'm blessed. I don't know how you say, but I have relationships with people that I am so grateful to learn from, with Indigenous leaders. So always finding about that. But I also am a part of a couple of white caucuses where we unpack our stuff. Like, wow, this showed up for me because I used to think that I will know all these stereotypes and they will be dealt with. Not so much. They are embedded into the fabric of the socialization of anyone growing up and coming to Canada. In the White Benevolence book, we saw how physicians came to Canada and are quickly indoctrinated into Indigenous specific stereotypes to be a part of the group that gets ahead. So understanding that they will always be there looking for them rather than trying to ignore them or pretend they're not there, looking at them with honesty and so that they can be recognized and then discounted before they impact our heart and our actions. So strategies to build competency and comfort takes practice and relationships and spaces like this workshop, learning the literacy so you know what it is you're talking about. And then these ongoing questions: how do you see systemic Indigenous anti-racism education supporting your work and practice, and what are you going to do about it? So that's and the next one is just our last one, talking about the reading, the other learning series that we have. And Linda, pass it back to you, and thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, I'm not going to say much here because I know we're getting close to time, but I've just popped in the chat our email address that goes to our student project coordinator, Ashley Janice, who keeps Laurie and I completely on track. And if you want to access any information about our BRAID project and the resources and events that we have, just shoot her an email and she'll get you set up. So with that, we'll turn it over to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laurie and Linda. Really fantastic comments and thoughts and teaching. Appreciate that a lot. Also, a lot of excellent reflection exercises. I want to thank the audience. Lots of wonderful comments, responses, and reflections on the questions that Laurie and Linda has posted. Maybe Suzanne, if I can ask you, just cut and paste the text so that we can send it over to Laurie and Linda to include in the word cloud. I think that'll be fantastic. There are two questions. The first one was actually at 12:38, and in some ways it's very relevant for the whole discussion. And that's talk about the controversy around Mary Ellen Turpo-Lafond. And I wonder, it's a complex situation. It's a long history. Also, has implications both in allyship or challenges. I wonder if you have comments on that or lessons we can specifically learn from that particular example, or things that we should keep in mind.
Wow. Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, there's so much. I think we could, it's tempting to have like almost like a full day workshop about, the issue of pretendians as it's getting framed. And I think it's really, if we think of this, continuum of allyship and being a co-conspirator, to the other end of the spectrum, which is, co-optation of identity, this is exactly the opposite of, it's like allyship gone wrong, because it's an inherent not being honest about one's identity and the role and relationship that they play with Indigenous people. Yeah, it's really, like exactly the opposite of the principles of working in this good way, is kind of, in a nutshell, kind of my thoughts on that without getting too deep into the weeds. Laurie, do you have any thoughts about it as well?
I have a few notes that I didn't bring up under white performativity that kind of relate to this a bit, I think. And it's been pretendiism has been written about as extreme cultural appropriation. And I've heard other topics that I was interested in learning about that I wouldn't want to touch as a white settler, thinking about, and then realizing now that this is a way where we call our people in and say, that's stepping over the line, and the harm and the cost to Indigenous people who have been doing this work forever, that have the lived experience, that have the long history of colonial harm. So another topic that's related to this is race adjacency or proximity, and that's where a white person lives with or has significant relationships with Indigenous or racialized people and assumes that this gives them a get out of recognizing your whiteness and white identity free card. So for example, you may have heard of, well, I worked in Indigenous communities for years. I have Indigenous friends and colleagues. They may wear or adorn themselves with Indigenous regalia and believe that's out of respect, but that's not understanding that how harmful that is, because that's another appropriation of, and then the extreme is the appropriation of identity and making claiming identity that's not actually true. So you may be aware of Rachel Dolezal in the US. So her story was written about quite lengthy, and I heard it on CBC and was very interested. And there is a paper there around the psyche that takes, so that somebody assumes and they have power. So those places, the power that some people have, especially, other people in other universities who've done the same thing. And really now organizations are requiring more thoughtful, careful identifiers in hiring and providing authentication around identity. So, and also when we think about the protocols around someone else is talking about being respectful of protocols. That's not respectful of protocols. So I appreciate the question and the pain that it's caused for a lot of Indigenous people who've been doing this work for a long time, and a lot of work now to go into that depth of work.
Absolutely. There are two questions now, so I'll lump them all together. We have 4 minutes, see if we can hit that. One is, as health professionals, this is a hidden question to me. As health professionals, how do I start my allyship with the patient in front of me, especially when that patient didn't really explicitly talk about this issue? The second question was two questions that were recently posted. What is perfectionism means on your slide? So you can combine the two and use the last 3 minutes for that. Thanks.
What comes to mind first is that the note that we made on the slide of listening more, and really like kind of that first step. And sometimes we don't have a lot of opportunity, like, because this is really working at the interpersonal level versus systemic, and I think it's taking the time to listen to that patient's story, and really truly hearing that, and and within that story, seeing if there's opportunities to perhaps advocacy is needed on behalf of the patient, or some extra work that we don't usually do as health professionals to connect someone with needed services, or to navigate the system, or to to elevate their needs within the system, because maybe they're not getting heard in the greater system among other healthcare professionals, would be one way I would say that you could start kind of in that immediate kind of environment. Laurie, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, that article by Tim Oken, perfectionism is a white supremacy trait, cultural trait. So the idea that we're going to be perfect, or we're going to have all the answers, especially as doctors or physicians in healthcare, wearing the white coat as the person, the knower, and the answer, have all the answers. So in that relationship, being humble, making a human connection, and recognizing the capacity of the physician to do life-saving work. I just wanted to thank Dawn. I see your comment in the chat about pretendians and defendians are basically warriors of white supremacy. They're tools of systemic racism created by the many influences that uphold a white society on white supremacy. Thanks for adding that, Dawn. But that article is really great. It goes quite depth in that, so maybe help.
On that note, unfortunately, we have to end. I'm sure we could have gone on with a lot more discussion, but I just want to thank Laurie and Linda on behalf of our audience. You've been tremendous, not only in part 1, but in this part 2, moving us from concept into actions. A lot of wonderful tips and great resources. Participants, I welcome you to check out those resources. And again, also on behalf of our partners, VCH, Indigenous Health, First Nations Health Authority, Ministry of Health, Vancouver Physician Staff Association, and ICON. I'd like to thank all the participants. Great engagement, really wonderful to interact with you. We look forward to our next round, and you can go to our website, iconproject.org, under Indigenous. The next round, you can register at that round. We'll also send out information for you on this. With that, thank you very much, everyone. Happy Friday, and hope to see you next time. Thanks again,
Thank
Laurie.
you so much again for
Thank
the
you.